allocation mechanism. So each signatory country would be allocated a certain number of refugees to accept based on the quota. The allocation would also consider things like the country's capacity to integrate more refugees, historical intake, and also the willingness to accept more. So we also can account for things like altruistic nature. But thirdly, then is tradability. Countries that are unable or unwilling to meet their quota are able to trade their allocation with other countries. For instance, a country with a high capacity and willingness to take in refugees could agree to accept more in exchange for compensation, not just in the financial form. It can also exist in other forms: economic aid, trade agreements, etc., from the country transferring its quota. But I think the way in which we'll encapsulate all of this is to tell you also about the regulatory mechanisms. Number one, in terms of what rights should be granted to refugees, we think this looks like three things. Firstly, in terms of basic needs. Secondly, in terms of protection from exploitation, discrimination, and violence. But thirdly, it's also in terms of social safety nets, where refugees are able to access things like employment, healthcare, etc. And the way in which we will make sure everything is regulated, we'll have some magical UN clause that countries have to abide by. And nicely leading into the second piece of framing, obviously this debate takes place in a world where the UN works, unlike the real world where the UN is quite useless. In this world, countries who should be willing and are able to take and trade refugees, and this is a convention that is plausible. Any attempt by opposition to prove that the UN has failed in the past and use that as precedence to argue why this mechanism will fail is against the spirit of the motion and should not be credited. First argument then on the principle of collective responsibility. The first part to this argument talks about why international organizations have a right to impose this collective responsibility. The first reason is voluntary membership and consent. Countries have voluntarily chosen to join international organizations like the UN and agree to abide by their rules and organization. This consent is foundational to the authority of these organizations, because at the point at which you consent, you don't just say, I'm doing this for tokenistic reasons so that I am recognized as a member of the UN, but also in terms of following the ratifying conventions or following the clauses of treaties is something that you abide by. But nicely then leading to the second point on international law and treaties, that when countries ratify international treaties, for example, in this case, they are signatories of the Refugee Convention, they are technically legally bound to follow the terms of those treaties, right? Even though there is no accountability in the real world, in debate world, we have to assume that this is a principled reason as to why they have a right to impose this. But thirdly then, it's on collective decision making. Wait, they said their internet broke off. I paused my timer.
We didn't hear like 1 minute 30 seconds. It was breaking. Do you think we could like restart?
We got you in regulations.
Should we all turn off? Should we all turn off the camera? IIU, is that better for you all?
Can you hear us?
It's the live stream.
We can hear you all.
Okay.
Okay. So
Is
what
it
do
the
we do?
cameras?
It's the live streaming.
Yeah, I think the live streaming is disturbing it actually.
Oh, then is it possible to stop the live stream?
Yeah. Lepas tu nak minta start balik ke apa?
Tak payahlah. From regulations lah.
Wait a minute.
Oh yeah, the regular basic safety nets.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
I took my hotspot, right?
Yeah. No, it's okay. Okay. Sorry, thank you.
Right, no worries.
Wait a minute. Okay, so should we continue? Is everything fine on the opposition side?
Yeah, now it's a lot better. Now we can hear and see us.
Okay. So I hope if anything happens, just let me know. Should I turn off my camera?
I don't know. Right now it's okay. So should you turn it off? Yeah, you should turn it off.
Okay, I'll turn it off.
Thank you. Sorry.
No worries. Okay. So I'm gonna continue from. Yeah. What?
No, in that case, if you turning off the camera, everyone can turn off, even the speaker.
Yeah. So I'm going to continue from regulatory. Yeah.
I'm sorry, but I need to turn on my camera at all time, and I hope that the speaker also could turn on your camera.
No, it's disrupting the debate. They can't hear us, so then the debate can't happen if everyone turns on their camera and the internet is bad. So I think we'll proceed with this way.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. It's fine.
Okay. I'm going to continue from regulatory mechanisms, starting in 3, 2, 1. In terms of regulatory mechanisms, here's where we talk about two things. Number one, in terms of what rights should be granted, we think this looks like three things in particular. Firstly, in terms of basic needs of refugees. Secondly, is the protection from exploitation, discrimination, and violence. And thirdly, is in terms of access to social safety nets like employment, healthcare, etc. And the way all of these things would be packaged is we would have clauses that countries have to abide by so that they can't renegade on these deals and they can't just renegade on being a signatory of the convention. But nicely leading into the second prong of the framing is that this debate obviously takes place in a world where the UN works and countries are willing and able to take and trade refugees. We think any attempt by opposition to prove that in precedence UN has failed to do this will be against the spirit of the motion and should not be credited. On to then the first argument on the principle of collective responsibility. The first part to this argument talks about why international organizations have a right to impose this collective responsibility for three key reasons. Number one, in terms of voluntary membership and consent, these are countries that have chosen to join these international organizations in the first place and agree to abide by their rules and regulations. This consent is foundational to the authority of these organizations because it allows for a collective form of taking action that is necessary when you are a member of an international organization. But secondly, in terms of international law and treaties, this is the point at which when countries ratify international treaties, they are legally bound to follow the terms of these treaties. Given that this motion has already given us by way of wording that these are signatories of the convention, means that this treaty or this additional mechanism will just be an extension of the treaty that already exists, making it legally necessary. But thirdly, then is in terms of collective decision making. This is when international organizations often make decisions through collective processes. The reason why the UN was built in the first place is because it's so that we as a country could prevent the next Hitler from existing again. But the problem in status quo isn't just individuals like Hitler. It's individuals that also cause other countries to go into refugee crisis, environmental problems that result in the displacement of people. And that is why collective decision making is important so that we can solve these problems, but at the same time so that we can maintain the legitimacy of the decisions made by these organizations. But the second part of this principle talks about why this is a principal obligation for three reasons. Number one, it's a moral and humanitarian obligation. There is a widely recognized moral and humanitarian imperative to protect those who are vulnerable and in need, right? So given that this is an acknowledgement that these obligations are important. But secondly, is in terms of international solidarity and responsibility sharing. The issue of refugees is often transnational with impacts and responsibilities that extend beyond the borders of a single country. That is why when we see refugees aren't accepted by other countries, neighboring countries then are affected when refugees overflood these countries, taking away from taxpayer money, but at the same time causing a lot of other social issues as well. Thirdly is in terms of complicity. The fact that when we look at instances of global wars, environmental degradation, failed states that currently exist is all due to instances of colonialism, hostile capitalism, and instances of industrial revolution, all of which show that these are failures that states have been involved in, then therefore they are complicit for the sufferings of refugees due to inaction. The impact of this is twofold. Number one, that it's important for us to abide by national conventions, especially by an organization that makes decisions for the collective good of society. But secondly, it's a morally imperative for us to prevent suffering, especially for vulnerable groups. I just want to take note that my time has not ended. I paused just now. Second argument then on why proceeding with this provides benefits by way of its mechanisms. The first part to this talks about allocation. Even before crisis happens, we can do things that will be able to contain the harm in the event it does. Two mechanisms that we can do in particular. Number one, we do research on countries and their capacity. For example, we are able to know how many refugees a country can take and allocate on those mechanisms instead of just randomly doing it when a crisis happens. But secondly, we can build infrastructure. The reason why refugees suffer so much in the status quo is because whenever they become a refugee, the countries that are housing them don't have the necessary infrastructure or the right resources that are able to house these refugees properly. Two impacts to this. Number one, we are more insulated in the event that a conflict happens. But number two, we are more efficient use of resources. The second part of this talks about quota. Before we understand why this is important, it's necessary to understand what the psyche of refugees are. They are likely to go to nearby countries because of things like the uncertainty of traveling in refugee boats really far away can result in you just capsizing and drowning before you even reach that country. That is why Syrian refugees go to Lebanon. That is why Palestinian refugees go to Egypt. When this happens, there tends to be an overflowing of refugees in these neighboring countries. And given that these are countries that are geographically proximate to these countries going through crisis in the first place, they are likely not going to be as equipped with the right resources and mechanisms that are necessary necessary to house these refugees. Why is this bad? Because countries then have to spend a significant amount of taxpayer money in housing these refugees, taking away from local populations. That's likely to result in problematic sentiments like racism and discrimination, but also tension in society that prevents us from doing anything meaningful. Lastly, then, is on accountability. Right now, there is no form of accountability at all for countries who are signatories. It's all talk and no walk. Developed countries push refugees to developing countries and unfairly push the responsibility onto them. There's two reasons why this is bad. Number one, the fact that these are developed countries, it's screwed up in the first place that they're pushing this burden to developing countries who have less of a capacity. But secondly, in terms of complicity, many times these are developed countries who are imperialistic in nature, like the United States, like all these other developed countries that caused this crisis in the first place. When they take down local governments, when they launch a coup using the CIA and the FBI, causes these problems in the first place. It is unjustified for them to push the refugees to developing countries. What changes now? Number one, countries actually get to demand.
I am so sorry for beating you because your time is already up. I also posted a timer when the internet connection is broke off from the opposition team just now. All right, so should we continue? Thank you to the Mr. Prime Minister. Up next, I would like to invite the leader of opposition, Ms. Nur Atifah, to present your arguments. Please welcome.
Hi, I just wanted to check that I'm audible.
Yes, you are audible.
1 second. Okay. Putting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The biggest flaw of side government's case so far is their choice to focus on the fact that there are quotas alone, but also ignoring the fact that these quotas are in fact ones which are tradable, which means the likelihood of them being treated as a form or an economic medium of trade within the realm of international relations is incredibly high. Let's go through that case, right? The first thing they told us is that the solution to Palestine and saving all the Palestinians is to distribute them among states in order to alleviate suffering. But they never really told us as to exactly why they enabled the escape in the first place. The true problem in this debate, we say there are two. Sorry, the true problem in this debate is the act of invasion itself, and we believe that in order to solve this, there are only two things that we can do. One, which is to pressure and have global recognition towards that crime of invasion itself. But secondly, the recognition of the refugee crisis and the prevention of the refugee crisis becoming a non-issue in and of itself. Let's talk about the mechanism, right? They told us things such as there's going to be a minimum quota. They told us about willingness, tradability, so on and so forth. And they said that in terms of regulation, the UN will magically become this good body, right? They claim that you can fear. And sure, let's say that in the beginning, when you implement this, everybody's like, yeah, I'm going to do exactly what you told me to do, and I'm going to be a benevolent actor. But what they cannot fear is the longevity and sustainability of this policy, because in reality, they are lacking checks and balance. There is a power disparity which exists within the UN, which will only be further strengthened by this policy, and also the creation of a non-issue by acting as if you've solved a problem when in reality you haven't. These are things that they cannot fear, and the fact that the UN has historically never worked and never been able to implement every single clause that they have because of these same reasons is something which we believe is worth attacking and in the spirit of the debate. Now, they talk about collective responsibility, right? Not much of this is contentious. At most, the only contentious part is this idea of complicity, that these people have been complicit in creating these issues, and therefore because of that inaction, there is a principal obligation for them to aid. But understand that this conflict due to colonialism, although we recognize that colonialism has been an issue in the past, implementing this policy in fact strengthens those people who were complicit in colonialism, because you allow the further the strengthening of this power disparity, and we'll explain that to you in our points here today. Lastly, they told us about the benefits, right? About how we protect refugees, so on and so forth. I'll prove to you exactly why this is untrue in my case here today, but also we'll prove to you why it is only on side opposition that we are really able to claim these benefits. Now let's go through them. opposition's case here today. The real issue, of course, is the refugee crisis. They are disproportionately displaced, and their needs are not met, right? Because these countries are often unable to handle their number of refugees, but also the countries bordering tend to be these poorer states. But also understand that in the bigger context of this debate, there is in fact a power disparity within international relations. There are certain levels of desperation which exist within these states. We believe that we opposition believe that the policy being implemented is one which actually takes advantage of this power disparity, the desperation created as a result of this refugee crisis, and allows for the harm and abuse of not only these poorer states, but the refugees within them. So what is it that we side opposition defend here today? We believe in the status quo, meaning that there will be no quota, and we recognize, sure, the refugees are more likely to go to these bordering states. But also understand that this does not mean that these bordering states will be 100% burdened, because in status quo, these refugees are now much more incentivized to go to other countries simply due to the oversaturation that's been pointed out by side government, right? This looks like Syrian refugees choosing Greece rather than Turkey in the status quo simply due to that matter. But also understand that in our world, the continuous international negotiation and the pressuring of the invading states is much more likely simply due to the recognition and the validation of the refugee crisis, rather than just shoving it under the rug, because, hey, you know what, at least we have quotas now. But also understand that the one who will be implementing any and all form of policy in this debate will be the UN, and understand how that historically they have not been impactful, but also they have been controlled by these hegemonic powers who are much more likely to abuse this system. So 3 things in my speech, right, under this context that I've given to you so far. Number 1, I'll prove to you why these poorer states are likely to be coerced into accepting more and their harms. But number 2, I'll tell you why these larger states will in fact abuse this trading system. And number 3, I'll talk to you about the comparative, why even in government's best case scenario, it is unlikely to be effective. First and foremost, why is it that these poorer states are likely to be coerced into accepting more refugees? Who are these poorer states, right? In this status quo, these are the states already suffering from a refugee crisis, right? They're economically spread thin. But in addition to that, they experience this sense of desperation, this need to have better diplomatic and economic tradability with these richer states, because all they really want is increased economic performance. Therefore, that incentivizes any and all form of cooperation with hegemonies, which means they have no choice but really to accept more refugees and to trade and to accept the trade of these quotas, right? Because this is a form of increased diplomacy, but and in addition to that, it increased horse trading with these larger states. This allows them to receive things such as cheaper imports, long-term contracts, FDI, so on and so forth, meaning that their incentive to accept it is very, very high. But understand the likelihood of being held accountable, but understand that the likelihood of them being able to have the capacity to care for those refugees is in fact very, very low, because these things were taken out of desperation, 1, but 2, it is only an agreement on paper, which is incredibly difficult to actually be accountable for. Yes, I'll take you POI. Be quick.
Yeah, if you give a country a choice between suffering with the overload of refugees or being exploited subtly through like a trade deal, which choice do you think they will choose?
I'll prove to you later in my next point about the abuse, why we prefer them to be overflooded with refugees. But lastly, why is it that the likelihood of being being held accountable for treating these refugees poorly are incredibly low? Understand that there is really no international court which is effective enough in holding them accountable. This is the same reason why Russia has not been punished for their war crimes, so on and so forth. We've seen it over and over again. Now, why is it that larger states will always abuse trading systems? Understand that the motivations of these larger states as these hegemonic powers are in fact people who want of these hegemonic powers are, 1, in a power race, which means that they will do anything and everything to expand their influence, but also these are the very people who control the enforcement arm of the UN, the UNSC, meaning that their ability to influence how these quotas go is incredibly high. How do they benefit from these trading quotas? Understand they benefit because they're able to coerce cooperation from these other states. The idea that China will stop disturbing a country like Malaysia as long as they take a higher refugee quota, even though you as a state do not have the capacity to do it, is incredibly high. Why is it that we prefer a world in which these states are overflooded why is it that we prefer our world in comparison to opposition government's world? Because the reality is this whole idea of overflooding these states is much higher in government's world, simply due to the fact that these states not only have to take the ones at their border, but now they are coerced to take more refugees as a result of these economic agreements. What this creates is, 1, a dependency on these larger states. That sovereignty is inherently damaged under side government's world. But also, even if this dependency doesn't already exist, these states are highly incentivized to further make one or to make any existing dependencies even worse. And for all those reasons, vote opposition. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I would like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister from the government team, Mr. Kuhan, to continue proposing the motion. Please welcome.
Give me 1 second, okay? All right. Oh, yeah, sorry. I'm not supposed to turn my camera. Okay. All right. Am I visible? Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. It is absurd that the case coming from opposition is just that UN is flawed and therefore does not work. They have to give us a counterfactual and any working model on how refugees have the capacity to be housed and given better living conditions in another country. If I'm able to prove why it's extremely privileged of opposition to say that refugees have a choice, they have nothing left standing under that case. 4 questions in his speech. Firstly, why is this something that's within the principal obligation of the United States, and why exactly this mandate is something that they can do? I'm proving here that this mandate is necessary, particularly the CRSR on vulnerable refugees. The first part of his argumentation is to note that when you're a signatory of an international treaty, there are 2 key features that we observed, and this came out in Hassan's speech. First is consent. Consent is important for 2 reasons. Number 1, it recognizes that countries' sovereignty and autonomy, but still understanding that countries are still willing to give up some level of their sovereignty to govern their own citizens and carry out their own decisions, but they choose to pivot towards what is mandated by this international convention. Second reason why consent is important is because it measures voluntariness. It shows that countries are willing to be bound by the terms of this convention without being done by way of coerciveness. Second key feature they were explained in Hassan was collective decision making. This was important for 2 reasons. A, it is important in times of crisis, especially refugee crisis that is global. We need a coordinated response. We need states to pool resources, share their expertise, and work together to address the transnational nature of refugee crisis. Secondly, it proves that we have capacity. Member states of UN are only patrons and arbiters of change for global issues. If it was just for one single conflict, one single health crisis that is singular, then you can send UNSC, you can send specialized bodies. But if the crisis is global, we need all countries to have a coordinated response, and only then we have capacity, and that's only present through global cooperation. Why then should this be the thrust of the UN, and why then can they oppose this mandate? 2 reasons. First is on accountability. We proved why we have much better accountability to take action. Because right now, if states promise they want to house refugees, we can enforce it. If they don't want to house refugees, at least we can take some level of the money to pool resources, whereas in the status quo, where they do nothing. If states say we don't want to take refugees, we have inaction, and therefore refugees suffer more. At least we have resources to the very least in our world. Second reason, we explain why states are complicit due to inaction. Why are states complicit? They're complicit because A, wars and conflicts, of course, occur based on selfish interests of authoritarian regimes, maybe, but we're intertwined due to economies. We're intertwined due to shared responsibilities to international organizations. Therefore, you have a responsibility. Second, we're also complicit through environmental degradation as well. There are so many refugees that leave because environment is fucked up. Places like refugees from Kiribati and Tuvalu, for example, that leave because of saltwater intrusion and land erosion. Refugees from Nepal, for example, that leave due to risk of glacial lake outburst floods in their country. All of this shows that environment is something we can regulate, and because we are shared proximity to environment, we have an obligation. And finally, we have a moral obligation to help each other in need because we're all part of the global proximity and global geography. What is the weighing here, and why is this argument alone already debate winning? Number 1, we prove why it's a principal right to mandate and impose this obligation. Opposition's win condition is they're able to prove why this is not within the spirit of the UN, or why they have a better counterfactual that actually addresses the problem. Secondly, I've explained on different level of mechanics in terms of consent, logistical capacity, and global accountability that is imperative for us to act now, and why it's an urgent action. This argument is debate winning. Secondly, how do we prevent hegemonic countries from abusing the system? I want to preface this by saying the only argument from that side is that it's Western proxy and it's an absurd idea because UN is shit. 4 reasons their counterfactual on choice does not work. Firstly, forced displacement. Many refugees are forcibly displaced due to conflict, persecution, and violence of human rights abuses in their home countries. In these circumstances, they don't have the luxury of choosing destination. Instead, they flee to wherever they have a safer option because the alternative is dying. Secondly, the lack of resources. Refugees often flee because they have absolutely no monetary capacity. They have no means to travel long distance. They have no means to choose specific destinations. They have limited resources and they can only capitalize on an option that gives them the safe haven rather than the hell that they're going through. Thirdly, geographical barriers. It's so stupid for them to say you can choose countries when countries have closed borders, when they have restrictive immigration policies, when they have political tensions between countries. You can't just willy-nilly say, I'll just accept any country and welcoming. It's not immigrants you're talking about, it's refugees. Finally, xenophobia. Refugees face xenophobia in so many countries because of the virtue of their identity. It's unclear why they can just choose. At this point of this argumentation, I'm proving why there's literally no choice in the world of opposition, and UN is the best entity that we have. Why do we fix the problems the opposition talked about on how hegemonic countries are bad? Firstly, it came out in first, they were mandated clause. We can enforce this convention in way of a long, if you look at this convention online, okay, sorry if it's that Googling, it's a fucking long convention that goes through many form of clauses. There's protection from exploitation and discrimination. There's access to fundamental amenities. There's also things like social security and education. It's such a long convention that makes sure they're mandated clause to make sure you're actually obligated to follow it. What changes now in our world? 4 parts to the change. Number one, countries actually get to demand and speak out against countries that are simply running away from their responsibilities. Even if the compensatory mechanism doesn't exist, the very fact that we have legitimate grounds to platform these concerns is already a good thing that is absent in opposition's world. Secondly, when developed countries are pushing the load of refugees to developing countries, they get compensation not just in terms of money, but in terms of trade deals and economic aid. These are far better mechanisms that actually trade the infrastructural aspects that propels this country forward and also helps its refugees. Thirdly, we can have building schools in areas with large refugee populations that also benefit local population. So the byproduct of helping refugees also have local populace, which means it's a win-win good. Finally, we can bring in FDI that's able to create adequate amount of job businesses that now allows for an increase in population. What we prove at the end of this argumentation is we have much greater accountability and much better delta with the way they manage refugees and also fulfill the populations at this point of juncture. Third question, how developing countries are able to benefit this and have capacity to contribute to this deal. Note that I'm responding to opposition's claim that you are coerced. The first thing I'll note here, your form of contribution is not only in the form of housing a refugee. You can also contribute in many ways. Number one, you can just give money. You can give money to states that want to house refugees, and that's already contribution to the refugee deal. Secondly, you can give expertise on how they can take in refugees because countries share borders and cultures and linguistic capacity as well. So you can just say maybe how you can deal with refugees that speak the same language. These are also ways developing countries or smaller countries can contribute. They are not just coerced to house refugees. Final argument, how can we manage and regulate conflict significantly better? So many refugees come from conflicts, either the Syrian civil war, look at the Rwandan genocide, look at the Bosnian war, look at the South Sudanese civil war. All this stems from war. In our side, we regulate this far better and manage conflicts far better because when you house refugees significantly better, we're significantly disincentivizing countries to abuse their states even more. But more importantly, we have intel sharing mechanisms and introspection with these countries to reform their systems, to make things better, to understand their proposition.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister. Up next, I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition, Ms. Munira, to present your arguments. Please welcome.
Testing that I am, actually, sorry. Yeah, just testing that I'm audible.
All right, you are audible.
Okay, just give me a second. Starting my speech in 3, 2, One, it is unjust and unfair for these countries to trade around these traumatized refugees, these traumatized war-torn children, women, and men all around the region for the sake of trade deals and having quotas, just behind the veil of trying to uphold this veil of trying to be humanitarian or trying to be just towards these people. That's simply a mask, something that government is trying to do. Two things that I'll do in my speech, right? First, I'll prove to you why we better protect these refugees in our world. And secondly, how it is going to be worse on their side of the world when this quota is implemented. But before that, 3 refutations, right? First refutation is on the principal right to impose obligation. Note that this principle is not true insofar as the harm or the effect of this principle outweighs the principal right itself for you to impose obligation. What do I mean by this? The very fact that these states are functions by the people's will and capacity means that first, if the people themselves within these states are xenophobic and racist, which is honestly majority of these countries in the first place, these refugees are going to be harmed and directly harmed as a result. But then secondly, let's look at the lack of infrastructure. Government claims that they will have infrastructure, but let's look at what the countries who are going to be accepting refugees actually look like. Note that because of majority of conflicts exist within the Middle East countries, in the Middle East region, this means that a lot of the refugees are going to go around these Middle Eastern countries, not countries like France, UK, or US, something that they're trying to argue. That's the scope that they're trying to argue about, which means that majority of the infrastructure and the capacity for them to have welfare, education, or healthcare is extremely low, meaning that the moment that you take in these refugees by sheer obligation, the moment that you're unable to have the capacity to actually take care of them, you're doing more harm to them than you are doing any good, which means that at the end of the day, this principle is broken by the very fact that the harm is outweighing this principle obligation for you to do so. Secondly, on terms of how this accountability acts as a form of sustainability, government says that you are able to enforce it because there is accountability by the states, but not acknowledging, note that government has never throughout any of their speeches acknowledged that there is a way out for this accountability. It's through this tradability of these agreement is how bigger hegemonic powers is able to escape accountability of having refugees and pushing it onto poorer countries and giving them trade deals as a result, is exactly how these people are going to escape accountability and exactly how this is not going to be sustainable in the long run. But then note that states who are complicit within the conflict, who have responsibility, also have no legal framework within the international law to actually hold them accountable. So accountability may exist on surface level or within your own moral values, but it does not exist on paper and you cannot be held accountable for it. Lastly, about how there will be a collective decision making, which means that there will always be capacity. Note that this is only going to be true if it is functioning within the EU, if you're trying to take in refugees from the Ukraine. But this is not true because majority of conflict happens in the Middle East, which means that the Middle Eastern countries that surrounds conflicts look like Lebanon. They look like Lebanon, they look like Saudi Arabia, and it looks like Iran. These are the countries who do not have the capacity of infrastructure, welfare, healthcare, or any democratic rights, which means that the capacity for these countries to actually execute and take care of these refugees are very low. Yes, except.
How can countries use this to escape accountability when they already do that in the status quo where there is no accountability mechanism? Now, at least we add that mechanism.
The mechanism is flawed because you can always trade deals and then impose your obligation onto poorer countries that don't deserve that much refugees in exchange for trade deals, which is more harmful because it's abuse of power. Moving on to my first point about how it is better and how we better protect human rights of these refugees in status quo. Note that considering 3 factors and 3 analyses to this. First is that there will already be ongoing negotiations. This looks like negotiations that are set by former Chancellor Angela Merkel to accept more refugees. There are constant discussions within the EU itself. There already exists critical mass in status quo where people are more aware, and the awareness towards trying to accept refugees is spreading globally, especially after the Ukraine and Russian war. But then secondly, right, there is local acceptance. And this is the prerequisite that we take into consideration before actually accepting these refugees. This was like Germany with the highest rate of refugee acceptance. acceptance is able to do so because there is a large political will within that state that was pushed by politicians in order for them to open their borders more broader. Note that comparatively on their side, refugees will be traded around the world without considering the people's acceptance, which is going to lead to more xenophobia. Because note that the moment that something happens or the economy crashes or there is a crime that is committed by a refugee, the anger or xenophobia is going to be directly targeted towards these refugees, harming them even more. But also note that thirdly, in terms of capacity, right? Unlike government side, these countries will function on the virtue that they have the capacity. So only when they have the infrastructure, welfare, and education structures are they able to accept these refugees. And this looks like Germany having immigrant housings and working towards a greater acceptance and greater systems for these refugees in status quo, and which is why you don't see Poland doing the exact same thing, because Poland just doesn't have the same incentive as Germany. But the reason why Germany is able to do those things is because they have the capacity. Countries with capacity and negotiating with other countries to increase capacity and local acceptance is exactly what is going to push for the acceptance of these refugees without having to face harms of xenophobia, so on and so forth. The impacts of this argument is that first, we limit xenophobia. Second is that we don't throw away a country with youth refugees to a lower living standard. Three is that we avoid abuse of power by hegemonic powers using refugees to pursue their interests, such as allyship and regional control. Second argument about how it's going to be worse on their side. It's going to be worse on, first, that the issue is still going to remain. What does this mean? Hegemonic powers like Saudi Arabia are going to use economic traits or like lowering tariffs in exchange for giving them higher quotas for poorer countries who need those things, like Tunisia or Lebanon. This leads to poor countries who are desperate for trade deals to willingly accept to take more quotas of refugees, not considering that they don't actually have the capacity to take care of them or the correct political will to accept them. This means that secondly, there will be a dismissal of issue on paper. When quotas are met, people are not even going to take into consideration that the refugee crisis still exists, because on paper it is currently being taken care of. And then third, what happens next is that this is going to cause a lack of capacity, but a lack of sustainability, because xenophobia and lack of infrastructure and capacity to actually carry out these things is going to be worsened on their sides, which means that the actual acknowledgement of human rights issues is only going to be worse. For all those reasons, side with opposition.
Thank you, Ms. Deputy Leader of Opposition. Moving on, I would like to call upon the government whip, Ms. Catherine, to continue proposing the motion on behalf of the government team. Please welcome.
Yeah, hi. Can I be heard clearly?
Yes, you are.
All right, thank you. I just want to check if I can turn on my camera. Is that okay?
Sure, I think there's no problem. If you want.
Great. I'll only take POIs exclusively in the chat, so please do not do it through voice or badger me. Thank you. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 parts to my speech. First, on the burden and the principal push coming from opposition. Second, on which side are refugees better protected. 3 levels to this, I'll explain later on. And third, on which side are countries as a whole better off. The first, on the burden that opposition took. I think they first highlighted in Leader of Opposition on the problem of invasion and how they will attempt to solve this by firstly pressure and global recognition and the prevention of the refugee crisis. 2 responses to this. The first, this is a burden that they took, by the way, panel. I think there's no attempt from any other speaker to discharge this burden in any way. Secondly, if it is true that the UN is so terrible that they can't enforce anything, that there's no accountability, the hegemonies don't exist, I really don't know how they're going to break the issue of invasion. Thus, refugees still exist on a very large scale on their side. Opposition shoots themselves in their own foot and then does nothing to discharge this burden. Panel, unfortunately, you have to be punitive on this. Let's secondly deal with their vague principle of not using refugees as trading cards. I think firstly, this is really the reality of international relations. Countries are rarely benevolent and countries rarely want to take in refugees to begin with. But as long as we manifest the benefit for these poor countries, we can trade off this principal hesitation the opposition has. And in fact, we welcome this because this opens up a lot of unique benefits to these poor countries and for showing you, at least proving to you why these refugees are better off. I think Assad's principle of why the UN can mandate this to begin with is already debate winning because we approve better accountability and secondly, absolutely absent of doing this, we are complicit, which is the side of opposition. The one miscellaneous thing I want to deal with inside opposition is their dismissal of like the whole refugee crisis. I really don't know why things become better on their side if refugees are going to the borders of Lebanon and Egypt begging for people to be let in, but countries like the US or China are able to escape obligation in any form or way. There's still dismissal of issue on their side. I don't know how things get any better. We've proven to you specifically why when there is a quota on each country to accept refugees and where you can trade them, countries can hold itself accountable. Thus, there's less of a dismissal of that issue. Second part of my speech, which side are refugees better protected? Opposition argued that overflowing of refugees will be worse on our side. And the premise that they rely upon for this argument is that refugees can choose to go to countries other than their bordering states. And this is also illustrated by how leader of opposition said that Syrian refugees can just choose to go to Greece. I think Cohen has already rebutted this extremely well when they proved that it's not likely that this is going to happen in any form or way because of the lack of money and the danger that it takes to travel to these other countries. But secondly, not a majority of refugees are privileged enough as what opposition claims. Thirdly, as well, are other countries going to accept you? I don't think there's any enforcement in status quo, particularly on side opposition, as to who will force these countries to accept refugees if they go to countries like Germany or Greece. So the incentive doesn't mean anything on side opposition if there's firstly no means and secondly no acceptance of these refugees. The second thing I want to respond to is their capacity argument, where they argue that capacity of these poorer countries will be low because they take these refugees out of desperation. I'm going to argue and flip this why desperation becomes less on our side. Firstly, through negotiations. These take times. You have to ensure that you're able to extract benefits from richer countries to be able to take these refugees to begin with. It doesn't really sound like desperation to me. But this is secondly, refugees not being allocated on side opposition increases desperation because more refugees come in illegally. Bigger countries unfairly pressure all these poorer countries to take in refugees, and this is exacerbated on side opposition. Thirdly, in terms of money, we are able to get a better capacity to house these refugees. If crisis is the most intuitive thing for these countries to respond to, they're obviously going to allocate some of the economic benefits that they can construct from these richer countries to solve, or at least put a solve on this refugee crisis to begin with. The third thing I want to respond to in opposition is on xenophobic and racist countries, and this is really indicative of a lot of their case, which is just extremely symmetrical with no solvency to prove why things become better. Even if this is true and these countries be extremely racist and xenophobic to these refugees, I'd argue and flip this into proving why these refugees will now be viewed as a means of an economic benefit. So all of the argumentation about how refugees are now like a trading card, how you're going to treat refugees badly, becomes better on our side because now you view these refugees as a unique opportunity for economic enrichment. These refugees are now likely to be viewed in a better way. Countries will be more willing to take refugees because you can extract economic concessions from these hegemonies that opposition is so worried about. Thirdly, what have we proved? Fourthly, what have we proven in my speech? Firstly, there's a moral obligation to protect these refugees. We have discharged that burden. Secondly, we've proven on a practical level why we have the capacity to take in refugees to begin with. Even if these smaller countries aren't able to do so in our world, they're able to contribute to this deal by firstly, they can trade these refugees if they can't, but also secondly, they can share expertise on how to deal with refugees that happens on their side. Most importantly, we protect the most vulnerable stakeholder inside of side opposition, which just leaves them on the shores of whatever country, hoping that these countries will be benevolent enough to take them in. Second part of my speech, which side are countries better off? I'm going to split this into three parts. The first, countries that take in refugees, which are more likely to be poorer states. Opposition argues that these countries be coerced. Coercion happens regardless, guys. I don't know why things become better on their side, but on our side, it's likely to become fairer because firstly, we have compensation for this. Secondly, when you bring these rich countries to the negotiating table, you can extract concessions for them. Thirdly, you're able to hold them accountable. It's easy to see when a country is not taking as much refugees as they should be, and it's easy to demand a compensation for these countries. It's much clearer and more visible on our side. Before 6, I'll take a POI.
No, it's okay. You can move on.
Great. Second part of this argument on how countries that don't take refugees. Opposition argued that big countries will escape their obligation and escape accountability in all forms. This argument panel is extremely uncomparative and unresponsive because our case provides exactly for this. The premises of their argument is true. There are hegemonic powers that exist. These hegemonic powers coerce small countries all the time. We formalize this into a negotiation, into a trade that can be enforced by clauses, by contracts that ensures that these countries get firstly compensated, but also secondly, the accountability here is that now rich countries have to pay these poor countries to house the refugees that they refuse to house. That is the accountability that we have, and that is exclusive on our side because this allows for fairer compensation for these poorer countries, and it allows for these rich countries to be able to contribute in some way to the refugee crisis. How do we have better accountability? Firstly, through mandated clauses. Secondly, through the right to demand for compensation for housing more refugees than they should have. We think all of these mechanisms are exclusive on our side. There's no ability for opposition to prove at this point of the debate how they have any accountability for rich countries that refuse to house refugees. The third, on like regional stability. Kuhn has proven to you really nicely how we reduce the incentive for civil wars and conflicts, which happens when there's a large displacement of refugees, by ensuring that they're allocated. Even if it means that they're allocated to a country that they don't particularly like, we think that is a fair trade-off that we're willing to make, because at least this ensures, firstly, that these refugees are protected, but this is secondly, that the region is more stable when you ensure that these refugees are not creating more of a crisis into areas and flooding the crisis into unstable regions. For all these reasons, your ballot should go no other than to Prim government.
Thank you, Ms. Government Whip. Moving on, I would like to invite the opposition whip, Mr. Anas, to present your arguments. Please welcome.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are, Mr. Anas.
Panel, let's make this really simple, right? 3 questions in my speech. Number 1, on principle. Number 2, whether it is likely side government's mechanism will work. And thirdly, just which world is our refugees better off in, right? Let's start with principle. Side government tells you 2 things. Number 1, that by virtue of consent, there is in fact a principal obligation upon these signatory countries to in fact uphold these contracts. But number 2, that considering there is now a collective decision-making ability, that they are therefore justified in making those decisions. Let's start with consent. Like, they fail to prove to you why this consent is likely to be one which is done fairly. We tell you this consent is invalid because signatory countries don't in fact have a choice in the very first place. 2 reasons, panel. Countries will be pressured into signing just because they require this legitimacy, this very recognition that you are in fact part of this collective UN, like this very collective that is in fact the most recognized collective in the entire world, right? But B, that developed countries will stop trading with poorer countries that don't in fact sign. This is highly likely because if they do in fact do so, they will in fact be reinforcing the idea that they do support countries which don't take refugees and which don't recognize this as an actual problem. But number 2, they will in fact be busy with trading with partners who did in fact sign with these particular, say, like with this particular UN contract, right? So we tell you on that basis alone, it is highly likely that the outcome then will be poor and in fact developing countries will be forced to sign this in order to say get this legitimacy. This is the very point in which, panel, refugees are unjustifiably pushed into third world countries. And we tell you this is the very point in which developing countries can defer their responsibility and tell their citizens that they have in fact dealt with this idea that there is a problem with refugees, saying that they have in fact signed these contracts when really they had just coerced refugees to enter much more poorer areas. On that alone, we tell you there is no principal obligation, considering the consent was in fact invalid from the very first place. The second reason why they tell you there is in fact a principal obligation, because there is this ability to have collective decision making. I want you to know that this principle alone is not enough to prove to us why the UN should in fact decide. This point rather is contingent on the outcome that refugees are and or rather will in fact be protected. Why is this true, panel? This is true because if not, decisions will just be made even if it is in fact against the values of these very refugees under the pretense that it is justified. This is the very point in which, panel, back in 1948, when UK decided to put a bunch of Jews in Palestine, that they would in fact be justified in future occupations, that they would in fact be justified in modern colonialism, and they would in fact be justified in genocide. We tell you consent is invalid, 1, and we tell you collective decision making is contingent on the outcome. If not, you are principally justifying genocide and or just the undermining of what these refugees have in terms of their values. There is simply no principal obligation here, and their manifest is poorer for refugees. Second question then, mechanization. Hassan comes up and tells you it is likely these refugees will be pushed into countries which will confer them rights of three. Number one, that they will receive their basic needs, that they will in fact be protected from discrimination, and it is likely they will be receiving safety nets in terms of what jobs they can get in the future. Note how this entire benefit is contingent on these clauses working at all. Hassan tried to fiat to you, or generally down the government bench, they tried to fiat to you that the UN will in fact enforce this law. We tell you he still needs, or rather down the bench on government side, they still need to prove to you why it is likely the UN will in fact be able to enforce this particular clause, more importantly, this particular law in general. And why wouldn't this clause be enforced? Simple. It's because mechanisms to enforce international law are extremely poor, panel. Two ways that they can in fact enforce this. Number one is just through coercive means. Coercive means looks like either military and or economic sanctions. These are opportunities, or rather choices, made only available to developing countries. And by virtue of that alone, we tell you developing countries will in fact be ones which are not pressured by coercive means such as war and or economic sanctions, considering they are in fact the ones who have the best militaries. And they are in fact the ones who will not then be scared to run over these clauses, considering what's going to happen, right? Malaysia is going to suddenly coercively force America to take refugees. Simply not going to happen. But secondly, peaceful means, like mediation, these very two mechanisms in order to enforce international law alone are extremely poor, and if not literally only exclusive to developed countries. What happens then? If developing countries don't enforce this particular clause, which our side has told you numerous amounts of reasons why they wouldn't, that these developing countries simply wouldn't therefore be pressured by military and or economic sanctions. And number two, if less developed countries don't enforce this clause, it is unlikely developing countries are to go as far as to in fact force and or coerce these countries to abide by these laws, considering these are the very same trade partners which are in fact upholding these developing countries' economies. The impact then is there is no legitimate law protecting these refugees from breach or protecting or
UI?
countries from breaching this clause. And because of that, but before that, yes.
Yeah, we've already explained how enforceability happens on our side through trade deals and negotiations. There are specific clauses between countries, as opposed to your side that relies on benevolence of countries.
Yeah, and we told you how this very benevolence is likely to be from countries which aren't in fact xenophobic. And it is this very non-xenophobic countries which are willing to not negotiate and just take refugees, which these refugees would be best in. Number two, that it is this very avenue to negotiate which makes these poorer countries use these refugees as assets, even though they can't and or don't have the capacities to actually take care of these very people. The impact then is extremely simple, panel. It is just that these developing countries can in fact tell their people that they have solved these problems, as though they were white saviors, when in actuality they had just been forcing these individuals, refugees, into countries which can't even take care of them. Let's go on to the last question, right? Which world is better off? Their speaker tried to tell you that coercion is a wash and it's just symmetrical on both sides. We told you clearly through Munira's speech that negotiations can only occur exclusively on our side, considering there is no avenue for poor countries to leverage these particular refugees as assets. What does this mean? It means the only actors left who are willing to take up these refugees will be ones who are benevolent and will be ones where their societies are ready and not xenophobic. If you want refugees to be saved, and not under this pretense of a principle, side with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Opposition Whip, for your speech. To proceed with the next agenda, we will now continue our debate session for this round with the reply speech session. The reply speech shall be delivered first by the opposition team. Therefore, without further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Nor Atifa to deliver her speech and conclude their debate. Please welcome.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Okay. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Hey, wait, not 3, 2, 1. Now, okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Three clashes in this debate. First and foremost, whether or not this power disparity that we've come forward is in fact harmful, and this is what I'll weigh up the points that given by side of opposition here today. Number 2, on the clash of who better protects these refugees, and lastly on solvency, because we've been pushed by side government to talk about how we solve the issue, right? So I'll do it to you in my speech here today, despite the fact that we've already done it, right? First and foremost, on the topic of the power disparity itself, both sides have conceded that this power disparity exists. However, side government has decided to say that this power disparity is in fact something which is good, because these countries who are richer will compensate for protecting the refugees when they treat them off, right? Understand that what they have told us in their mechanism is that these people will accept this quota as a trade. What they did not mechanize is this idea that these things will have these terms, so on and so forth. But they also did not tell us why these richer countries have this incentive to put in to negotiate these terms for protection of these refugees in the first place. Understand why it is incredibly unlikely that these states will go above and beyond and be so benevolent in order to ensure that their refugees are protected, right? First and foremost, when it comes to these poorer countries who are desperate for this compensation, some compensation will always be better than none, which means the likelihood of them taking bad deals, is incredibly high. But also note that these are countries which are already and have been recognized in this debate as states in debt, which means they have this other plethora of things to spend on. These are states which can barely afford to subsidize things such as healthcare. Why would they ever prioritize refugees? Something which failed to be addressed by side opposition, a government here today. But why is it unlikely that these states will consider the capacity of the states that they choose to negotiate in with these states? Simply because they don't need to. Because in order for them to consider the capacity, we need to assume their benevolence, something which was not proven by side government here today. Now, onto the second clash as to who really better protects refugees from all these harms of xenophobia, livelihood, so on and so forth. What side government has come to us, they told us that this capacity, the overflowing of refugees is better on our side. And they told us that this is unlikely that this is much more likely in our world, because of this danger of traveling, which means that they will be overflowed into the bordering states. The thing is, this danger of traveling is something which is symmetric in both worlds. And I didn't think I would need to say this, but their best case scenario is that these rich states will take in the poorer, will take in these refugees, right? That danger of traveling still exists. So obviously the mechanism is that they will be transferred to other states, right? It's symmetric in both sides. I don't think this is contentious. But also, why is it that these richer states are more likely to take in refugees in our world in comparison to government, right? Understand that if it is true that we need to fulfill this principal obligation, right now, in order to fulfill the principal obligation, the only option in opposition's world is to take them in. As we've stated in DLO, right, as to why Germany keeps on taking, because this is the only way that they can express their willingness to actually help these refugees and look like better actors on the international stage. And in government's world, you provide them with the option to throw these refugees at poorer states, meaning that the ability to leverage these refugees and still look like a good person is much higher. But lastly, on the issue of solvency, right, on solvency, on which side actually better pressures or overcomes the issue of invading by these oppressive states. When it comes to these states which have been complicit in the harms based on the premise of government's case, right, whether it's a result of colonialism or environmental harms, understand that in governments, that in our world, we provide them no other alternative than to either pressure these invading states to sanctions, so on and so forth, or take these refugees themselves. The ability for you to push that burden onto these poorer states who do not even have the capacity to take care of them and get away or willy-nilly and look like a good actor at the international stage is much better on our side. If you really want to hold these people accountable to the UN conventions that you claim to be so effective, understand that this is only possible in our world because the burden onto these powerful hegemonic countries, it's higher, and the ability for us to actually monitor how these people are doing is much better in our world. And for all of those reasons, your ballot should not go anywhere other than opposition. Thank you.
Thank you to the representative from the opposition team for the reply speech. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Assad from the government team to proceed with their reply speech and conclude their debate. Please welcome.
Can everyone see and hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think the funniest thing we heard from opposition is that in the event of overcrowding, refugees have a choice in terms of where they want to go to. If that's the case, I want to be a refugee also. Today I go to Egypt, next month I go to Greece, then after that I jump to Lebanon. I get all kinds of different experiences. 2 callouts at the top of my speech. Number 1, let's debate under ops paradigm, where the UN is shit. Both sides, the UN is shit. On Gov, we say we have a clause where in the worst case, countries don't follow and simply use it to escape accountability. Number one, we still get the compensation. Number two, we still have legitimate grounds for call-outs. Secondly, on opposition, they want to get solvency for invasions through global recognitions and ceasefires. Let's take a look at this, Judge. If both worlds, the UN is horrible, is it easier to get compensation and call-outs, or is it easier to get boycotts, calls for ceasefires, and like calls for decision making or whatever that you want to get through their global recognition mechanism? But the second call out is in terms of principle. We give you a very clear principle on the UN and why it's fair to impose this, why this is an obligation to prevent suffering. Their response is consent, that these countries did not consent. But Judge, if they were hearing carefully, consent is literally the first part of the principle by the very fact that these countries are damn signatories of the convention in the first place and they are members of the United Nations in the first place. Anas tries to revive this in his speech, but let's put it back in the coffin. First issue then on developing countries, opposition says this is when you allow these countries to take advantage of power disparity through things like coercion, cheaper imports, and you cause a dependency on big countries, and therefore they use this as an excuse to escape accountability. The isolated response that I want to give is that power disparities exist anyway in the status quo. At least now we capitalize on this disparity so that we're better off. But what are material that we give that overweighs this already? Number one is in terms of preparedness and accountability. When we do this, we can plan resources and infrastructure much better so that both the refugees and the country have a better experience when they're housing these refugees. But secondly, if countries are escaping accountability in status quo, at least now there are grounds to call out. There are grounds to hold these countries accountable. In the worst case, we can't do that. At least we get money. Both worlds, there's some form of exploitation. In our world, we get money. They get apologies, thoughts, and prayers. Second issue then on refugees, the opposition says here is where you get a poorer quality of life due to things like xenophobia, because now you use refugees as trading cards. Their mechanism, Judge, is benevolence. The first thing I want to say is, Jesus Christ, if benevolence is real, refugees won't exist. But secondly, benevolence of countries is activated better by our mechanisms. The fact that if you're a big country that's benevolent, not only can you take in refugees, but you can help a developing country while doing so. Therefore, your benevolence points goes up by 10 or whatever. But what did we tell you in terms of xenophobia? We told you xenophobia is worse when you overflood these countries with refugees. Let's weigh this then. In our world, you're more prepared to take in refugees because resources and infrastructure has been allocated. The worst case is we need to take in more than we can, but at least we get economic aid and money that we can not just use to benefit refugees, but through things like FDI that can benefit local populations as well. When we build schools for refugees, local populations can go here as well. Their world, the refugees overflood, causing more resources to be spent on them, causes more tension within local populations who blame these refugee groups as taking their taxpayer money and other resources that could have gone to them. And their mechanism is we can get more benevolent countries like Germany. I think it's pretty evident, Judge, if you consider the mechanisms that we gave to you and how we exactly spelled out how xenophobia breeds even more within the populations of the countries that they want to flood these refugees with, versus our side when we have actual mechanisms to prove to you how we are able to solve this xenophobia through activating the preparedness of the country, through allowing refugees to actually stay with this country in a non-overcrowded way. But even in the event overcrowdedness exists, we can mitigate against all these kinds of tension with the help that we give to these countries. Therefore, even in the worst case, we have more exploitative trade deals. We have worst off, we have increased exploitation of smaller countries in our world. At least we get money. Judge, if you care about the Palestinians, if you care about the Syrians, if you care about the Rohingyans and all the displaced people of the world, the ballot goes to Malaya. So proud.
Thank you, the representative of the government team, for the reply speech. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now reaching the end of our session today. Congratulations and thank you to all debaters from both teams for your wonderful, informative, and fruitful speech. For your information, this round, round 4, is a silent round. Therefore, there will be no verdicts and comments as well as results given by the judges. Instead, the results will be announced in the next announcement session, which is scheduled to take place at 4:45 p.m. later today. All of you here are invited to join the session using the briefing room link. Thank you. I'm sorry, using the bilik pengumuman keputusan link. All right, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed to the photography session, and therefore, to all adjudicators and debaters, please kindly turn on your camera so that we can proceed with the photography session. Everyone ready? All right, opposition, you may remove your visual background maybe.
Mr. Hasbul, you're missing.
All right, okay. Okay, everyone ready? In 3. Right, okay. Ready in 3, 2, 1. All right, that's great. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your cooperation and for your time spent here in this debate round. Thank you so much, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. You may dismiss them.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you for the debate, guys. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
guys.
guys.
Bye-bye.